Good morning, Foundry, and thank you so much for being with us this morning. I hope that wherever you are and whatever you're doing, that you can feel how wanted and welcome you are here in our online gathering. This morning, we're going to shake things up a little bit and start with communion first. If you're anything like me and you forget literally every week to have what you need on hand to take communion, now would be a great time to run to the kitchen, grab some food and drink, and come back. We're going to sing a song together, and then afterwards we'll take communion. Our friend Sarah from Revolution in Annapolis is going to lead us in a song this morning, and as she sings this song, as we listen to the words and sing along, I hope that you'll look at this tiny piece of bread in this little cup as just the smallest picture of the great feast that communion truly is. Communion is a feast of reconciliation. The Bible says that those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for what's good and right and just, are finally satisfied in Jesus. The communion table stretches across every possible border, even the border of time itself. All of the Passover feasts of old were pointing towards it. Every time communion has been taken ever in the history of the world, it was pointing back to this moment in time where Jesus, through his broken body and his blood poured out and his resurrection, reconciled us to God and reconciled us to each other. And so let's meditate on that our fight for justice and for peace, our fight to take up the cause of the downtrodden and the brokenhearted and the oppressed, all of that finds its root at the table of reconciliation in Jesus. It's his strength, not ours. He is the living bread. He's the provision. It's not our own strength and our own physical bread, because tomorrow we're going to need more food after we eat this. But in Jesus, this picture of who he is and what he provides, that we find the power and strength and energy to fight this good fight, to be reconciled to each other. So let's meditate on that as we listen to this next song. And when the song is done, we'll take communion together.
You've prepared for me in the presence of my enemies. It's your body and your blood you shed for me. This is how I fight my battles. There's a table that you've prepared for me in the presence of my enemies. It's your body and your blood you shed for me. This is how I fight my battles. And I believe you've overcome, and I will lift my song of praise for all you've done. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I fight my battles. This is how I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. This is how I fight my battles. 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 This is how. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I know the truth. It may look like I'm surrounded, but I'm surrounded by you. This is how I fight my battles.
The Baltimore lawn chair. In the spring months, it becomes this object that you can use to sit on someone's roof deck and build community. In the summer, it can be this thing that you put in your car to go down to the ocean, hon, and to put your feet in the water and to take in some sun. In the fall, it can be this thing you take to the campfire or the bonfire to hang out with friends and build community. But in the winter months, the Baltimore lawn chair has a very divisive role. You see, because when it even snows just the tiniest of bits, just the tiniest amount, right? As people go out to shovel and get on with their life, the Baltimore lawn chair becomes this placeholder of, I've earned this spot because I dug this spot out, or I can't believe how entitled the world is. It's so entitled as to think that this lawn chair marked on public property is something that I should respect and ultimately not move my car into, potentially in a neighborhood where parking is tight, right? And I'm going to let you slip into the comments here and give your perspective on, in the winter months, to chair or not to chair. You riff, you go, you tell us what you think about that idea. But because here's the thing, as you kind of pontificate and as you share your thoughts about to chair or not to chair, only the foolish and the most horrible of people would ever put out the lawn chair, or only the fullest and most unreasonable people would not respect the back-breaking labor of someone digging out a spot. whatever view you ascribe to, it says something about how you understand the world's working and thriving and flourishing. It says something about your picture of justice. And we're going to need that today as we go into week 5 of our series, A Better Kingdom. What we've been doing in our time together is looking at the book of Isaiah. And as we've looked at some of these most beautiful and robust pictures in the Old Testament about the hope and character and nature of the kingship of Jesus and the kingdom of God that the Messiah Jesus was going to usher in, we see those verses in their context against the backdrop of a people who trust in idolatry, who trust in kings, who believe in follow, kind of their own civil religion and kind of the nationalistic ventures, or even just grow complacent with religious rituals with no real heart behind them. And we'll see over and over in the book of Isaiah that fails to deliver the freedom and flourishing that the servant king that we've been talking about and thinking about and that Isaiah's been pointing to is ultimately offering the freedom and the hope and joy and all of those things. And so the question for us last week was, is this suffering servant was going to not just be a king who would experience the brutality and violence and wouldn't operate in those things, but would actually feel the sting of those things by coming into the world and conquering them in an upside down kingdom kind of way. The rest of the book shifts. The final chapters of Isaiah shift into this idea of responding to and aligning with that suffering servant king. And one of the ways, 56 verse 1, gets it right started right away, that we do that and we respond to that servant king is in our understanding of justice and reflecting the servant's understanding of justice. And so that's what we're going to look at today is how do we align ourselves to the heart of justice that's reflected in the servant king. As we think about justice, we might come back to, again, that lawn chair analogy, right? If you're pro lawn chair and marking the spot, you think, tell those people about all my individual work and how, I deserve and I've earned, it's just for me to claim that spot as my own. Or conversely, right? Those of you who are like, hey, man, that is so selfish. So, your picture of justice, you want me to preach to that person or that person, right? But the reality is, the picture of justice that's being personified here in Isaiah 58, the passage that we'll look at today, is a frightening passage for you and I because it takes a group of people who think they have a complete grasp and understanding of justice. It takes them and exposes them for what their understanding of justice really is. Something that's way more self-serving and actually not in line with the suffering king's picture of justice. And so for you and I, this passage challenges us to, if we're gonna say that we understand justice, if we're going to be people of justice, we first have to ask the question of, who does our picture of justice of? And who is it for? Ultimately, who and what does it reflect? The picture of justice that you have today, whether it's about lawn chairs or various topics about injustices in the world, what does it ultimately kind of point to in terms of what is shaping and defining and making those, what series of assumptions goes into that understanding? And what we'll see here in chapter 58 is that God is not pleased with this particular group of people. Isaiah chapter 58, verse 1. Shout it aloud, do not hold back, raise your voice like a trumpet, declare to my people their rebellion and to the descendants of Jacob their sins. Okay, so God is critiquing, he's rebuking, he's not pleased. Why? Verse 2, for day after day they seek me out. They seem eager to know my ways, as if they were a nation that does what's right and has not forsaken the commands of its God. They ask me for just decisions. They seem eager for God to come near them. Why have we fasted, they say, and you've not seen it? Why have we humbled ourselves and you have not noticed? Yet on the day of fasting, you do as you please. You exploit all your workers. Your fasting ends in quarreling and strife and in striking each other with wicked fists. You cannot fast as you do today and expect your voice to be heard on high. What does this have to do with justice? Well, this group of people feels like God has been unjust to them. Hey, God, we're fasting, we're doing the things you told us to do, and yet you're not doing things our way. You're not giving us what we want. That's not fair. That's not just. How dare you? And God turns that on their head by saying, how dare you co-opt my picture of justice and use it to just bless you and only think about you. You're taking my words, you're taking my sentiments, and you're using it to build something that does not reflect my heart. Their picture of justice looks a lot more like the neighboring, pathways to gods and goddesses in the cultures around them, right? You do these things, you build the list, and if you do those things, this God is going to give you what you want. That's fair. That's a good transaction. Right? What God is trying to tell them is like, hey, you think you understand my picture of justice, but your picture of justice that you've ascribed to me is really just one that builds your kingdom and your ways. And so for you and I, who might have a picture of justice, who want to see justice prevail in the world, who want to see the flourishing of all things, right? One of the questions and one of the traps for us to maybe check ourselves on is that picture of justice that we have today. What is fundamentally shaping it? And is it the character and nature of God? Or are we co-opting that picture of justice to build something that's really of our own making? Okay, the Old Testament word for justice is mishpat. It's this idea of a word that is not just retributive, right? Like you did a bad thing and so this is what happens to you. It's restorative. It's about not just punishing things that go wrong, but bringing flourishing and repair to where there's breaches. We take words like peace and we go, oh, that's just people kind of getting along with each other. When in fact, the word of peace in the Old Testament really speaks to a holistic idea of flourishing. When we look at the idea of righteousness in the Old Testament, we look at it this being a kind of a prevailing of God's heart and God's character revealing in terms of what's right in the world. Not just what you think, but God's character and heart on display. What we have in these words like justice is not just a list of bullet points about rules and guidelines and what's fair. The idea of justice is rooted in the very character of God and the outworking of that character, which is never less than just, right? But your picture and my picture of that is prone to our humanity. It's prone to co-opting by the way our heart feels, by the culture that we live in, by the things that just our sinful natures want to get done. The question for us is, are we like this group in Isaiah who's saying we care about justice and then just doing whatever we want, saying that we care about justice and exploiting people around us, saying that we care about justice and in fasting, and yet we're fighting with others and not really pursuing. See, the purpose of the fast was to align themselves to God's heart, not to co-opt God's heart and then turn it back on God as like, hey, I'm entitled to something. Come on, pay up. And we might say to ourselves, I don't do that. But if we really slow down, it's incumbent of us to, if we really want to fully understand God's picture of justice, to really let that picture of justice also speak to us about us and the ways in which that picture of justice can be co-opted in our time. Let me just give you 3 quick ways. I don't have a lot of time to get into them as full, but you can go to foundrybaltimore.com/this Sunday and you can see a little bit more on each of these things. One way is just like our own cultural values have the capacity to distort that picture of justice in our lives, to misunderstand God's picture of justice. Every universe, every culture has a sense of this is the way the world works. Here's some theories, and we've got kind of 4 predominant ones. Dr. Tim Keller wrote an essay about kind of 4 modern schools of thought about how the world works and how justice prevails, and you can find that in our This Sunday page. And what I love about that respective passage is that it points to the idea that entry does of rather than just deconstruct all those things and go, well, they're stupid and they're wrong. They say, well, he goes, hey, here's some things that actually point to God's picture of justice in the Old Testament. But here's the things in each of those views that are just a touch short-sighted, that don't speak about that idea in full, right? So that we can, because it's the air we breathe and it's the water we drink, so that we can take captive those thoughts and think strategically about the ways in which we are just carrying fundamental assumptions and projections about words like justice into our understanding of God. Right? What's more is in our family of origin, there's things that we've learned about how the world works that might contribute to and help us understand God's picture of justice, but may also blind us or help us not really see in full. For example, from my story, really quick, I grew up in Western Maryland. I grew up in a household where we were told that people from every tongue, every tribe, every nation had inherent worth and value. I did not grow up in a family that openly spoke negatively about people from other races and ethnicities and cultures. I grew up in a place where if I had ever heard that said out loud in public, or jokes, things like that, and my parents would have heard that, they would have used that as a teachable moment to say, hey, that's not what we do. That's not right. That's not okay. If I had brought any of those jokes into my home, I don't know what would have happened to me, but it wouldn't have been good, right? But that does not mean, because that's a good thing, it's a good worldview, it's a good foundation, it doesn't mean that my understanding of justice is complete and full as it relates to the idea of reconciliation and race and justice in America. That I have more to learn, and I really that collided with that big time when I moved to Baltimore. And I began to hear from my neighbors about how their stories about justice and injustice were different from mine. And there was more work to do in my heart. My last thing is my own human limitation can skew my understanding of justice, right? So when you fly up Interstate 83 past me at 80 miles an hour, I'm like, you're a fool, man. You need to be pulled over. You need to be held accountable. But if it's me, I had a very good reason to be going 80, and I had very clean control of my vehicle, thank you very much. And why are you picking on me when everyone else is doing the exact same thing? You see, my own heart has the capacity to not see in full. We might want to buy the cheap t-shirt, but we don't think about the idea of where that t-shirt came from. We want the freezer full for our family because we're providing for our family in a pandemic, but we're not really thinking about how the implications of that play out for people that are relying on maybe a weekly trip to the grocery store. What's been discipled into us about justice will need to be discipled out of us. And so one of the most freeing but scary and dangerous prayers of the scriptures is when the psalmist says, search me, O God, know my heart, test me and know my anxious thoughts. That if we want to come to a place of understanding justice, we have to take this information about the character and nature of God that we're being given, let it move from our head to our heart, move it from our heart to our hands, let all of us grow and be discipled in this lifelong journey of becoming more and more like Jesus. This idea of justice is less about this thing that I possess and the rest of you all are stupid, and more about saying, God, work in me, help me and my picture of justice more and more reflect your heart. You see, what if we used our understanding of justice to be less of the tone police and more to police our own hearts, to speak to our own idolatry, to speak to the own ways in which we co-opt this picture of justice and rob the world of seeing the love of God in full. You see, it's not enough for us to say today, well, I'm not oppressing anybody. I fast, I do the right things. It wasn't enough for the people in this passage. It's not enough. Rather, this invitation that this is being offered here in Isaiah 58 is to say, hey, what that fasting should have done is helped you reframe and see your resources differently, to give you different eyes, right? If you're not eating bread, that you might look around and so, man, that person needs bread and that person needs bread. And I don't really pay attention to hunger, but now I can't unsee all the people who are hungry. Rather than the way it's playing out in Isaiah 58 verse 3, where I'm like punching out my neighbors and exploiting my workers. The Red Sand Project is something that Araminsa Freedom Initiative has been using in the month of January to help just create that moment of reflection by pouring sand onto the ground of a sidewalk or a road and letting that sand kind of fall into the cracks. And in Baltimore, we got lots of cracks in the roads, lots of holes, By letting that sand kind of seep in, it's been an invitation to match that to the prayer of God, give me your eyes to see where I am perpetuating injustice or where I'm overlooking people who have fallen through the cracks, rather than I've done the right things, give me what I want because everyone else is stupid and doesn't get it. When we understand that picture of justice, when we let that picture and God's picture of justice, and we go on that lifelong journey of it changing and transforming us, we begin to move to the idea of embracing justice as a verb. And that's where the passage really moves. Verses 6 and 7. Is this not the kind of fasting I've chosen, to loose the chains of injustice, to untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke? Is it not to share your food with the hungry, to provide the poor wanderer with shelter, when you see the naked to clothe them, and to not turn away from your own flesh and blood? I love this passage here because it's what he's not saying is, hey, if you want to know whether or not you're saved, you do these things and you get gold stars. Certainly you don't have to know in full the totality of justice to give someone a meal or things of that nature. No, rather what it's pointing to is that as we get God's eyes and heart, that translates to the things that we will do with our hands, the ways in which we'll carry that out. It becomes a verb. We will pour this out in how we live our lives. Dr. Christina Edmondson speaks about it this way. She says, when I think about social justice, and I'm thinking about the acknowledgement that our systems, practices, government structures, and communities from a Christian standpoint have been impacted by the fall, they're not right. They're not as they should be. That's why we're called to do justice as a verb. The social element speaks to the populace. That means that we are actively engaged in doing justice that involves our neighbors for the good of people who we want to be our neighbors and people who we don't want to be our neighbors. You see, justice in this moment isn't how so many times we see it used. It's not just a passive statement to protect our brand or to make sure that we're woke enough for blank. It's about pouring ourselves out. Verse 6 speaks to the long-term nature of that, looking at breaking cords of oppression, setting oppressed free. Like there's not something there that has like an end date or destination. Like that's a whole life work of looking at our context and going, where is that oppression? Where is that injustice? How do I create solutions that bring flourishing around me? But then verses 7 through 9 speak to the meeting of practical needs: food for the hungry, the poor with shelter, clothes for the naked, caring for families. These are very practical short-term things. So many times in our conversations about justice, we yell back and forth. We play this textual tennis about which of those two things is more important. We look at Isaiah 58 here and we go, yeah, it's both. The followers of Jesus, pursuers of the way of the kingdom of God, must be radically committed to the short-term and long-term implications of carrying out God's picture of flourishing. One of them probably comes more naturally to you. One of them comes more naturally to me. The question is, how do we then, shoulder to shoulder, or 6 feet apart to 6 feet apart with our masks on, get out there and be about that work rather than talking ourselves out of, well, I don't really have this and I don't have this. The question isn't whether or not as a follower of Jesus you should engage. The question is where. Where should you engage? What are your gifts? What are your passions? And how does your unique story play a role? How does the way that your heart has been broken play a role? And then what do you do to get proximate to those things? How do you become a voice for those things? And as we do that, 4 things begin to happen. As we see here, Isaiah 58, verses 8 through 12. We see new beginnings. We can imagine new beginnings for ourselves and for the city. We can see personal restoration and healing. It's been so good to see some of that in the pandemic as we see AA groups and trauma healing circles form in the midst of things going on at the Foundry that are really the outpouring of people going, I've got a story to tell, and I want to be, I've been healed, and I want to play a role in the healing of others. It's a long view of security and flourishing. It's not just focused on quick fixes. Verse 11 talks about the satisfying needs in a sun-scorched land. It's so easy for us just to sort of be discouraged by the things we don't see happening versus trusting that the investments that we're making today will carry a long-term impact. I know that's been a struggle for me this year with all of the pivots that we've made. And then lastly, fellowship with the Lord. I love where this passage ends because it connects back to the Sabbath. It connects back to, in verse 13, if you keep your feet from breaking the Sabbath, from doing as you please on a holy day, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's holy day honorable, if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find joy in the Lord. And I got to tell you, when it comes to this idea of justice, I'm so tired of people saying they care about justice and then doing as they please. I'm so tired of saying that they care about justice and then finding out those things are really just idle words and clever hashtags. The Sabbath, the connection back to God reminds us that it's not about our lesser picture of justice that will bring a complete picture of flourishing to the world, but by being connected to the one who is the Savior. And it's not you, and it's not me. Thanks be to God. As we close, I want us to reflect on this quote. The most eloquent testimony to the reality of the resurrection is not an empty tomb or a well-orchestrated pageant on Easter Sunday, but rather a group of people whose life together is so radically different, so completely changed from the way the world builds a community that there can be no explanation other than something decisive has happened in history. The tough task of interpreting the reality of a truth like the resurrection is not so much the scientific or historical, how could a thing like that happen, but the ecclesiastical and communal. Why don't you people look more resurrected? May we look more like the resurrected Savior who has given us life and pushes us to be a picture of that life to a thirsty and weary world. Amen.
Hi, I'm Laura Coleman, the Director of Education and Prevention for Araminta Freedom Initiative. Every year since 2010, January has been dedicated as National Human Trafficking Prevention and Awareness Month. But our work at Araminta Freedom Initiative continues year-round to awaken communities to this criminal industry that is in our midst. It was also in 2010 the founders of Araminta started asking the question, what is God's call on the church to respond to child trafficking? And much of their work was inspired by the book of Isaiah. In Isaiah 58, we have a declaration for God's people to turn from lives of hypocrisy and change their ways. I think it would be impossible to read Isaiah and not feel convicted to take a hard look at my own life. In chapter 58, Isaiah talks about being so caught up in our spirituality and doing church things that we miss our call to set ourselves apart and be the church. Across Maryland, more than 670 child survivors of sex trafficking have been identified in the last 7 years, and there were 141 cases reported to DSS offices in 2019. During COVID, the concerns of trafficking escalated in direct correlation to the amount of time our youth are spending online. Traffickers are keenly aware of that and have increased their efforts to capitalize on the vulnerabilities of our youth. Our FBI partners tell us that as many as 750,000 predators are online any given moment waiting to intersect with a vulnerable child. COVID-19 created additional vulnerabilities for youth, leading to increased financial instability and insecurity. And as a result, basic physical needs of food, warm clothes, and shelter were not being met. We are surrounded by communities that are at risk, and the current economic picture elevates that risk. Last January, I was working with a group of students in a Baltimore City high school that sits less than 5 miles from the Foundry. During our time together, I explained the definition of child trafficking and that anytime someone under the age of 18 is involved in a commercial exchange of food, money, drugs, alcohol, or anything of value for a sex act, they are a victim of a crime according to our federal law, even if they say they are choosing the behavior. When I shared this with the students in this high-risk community, 2 junior girls shrugged their shoulders and said, "That happens every day here." The truth is that sexual exploitation is normalized in our city and in our culture, but we have to be willing to see it and keep these children from slipping through the cracks. As much as we want to point at all the people outside the walls of the church that create this problem, statistically, the numbers inside the church are not any different on this issue. So what is it that we are doing or not doing as a church that leaves our young girls and boys vulnerable? Isaiah addresses the exploitation of people in verse 3. "Yet on the day of your fasting you do as you please and exploit all your workers." And in verse 6 he states, "Is not this the kind of fasting I have chosen? To loose the chains of injustice and untie the cords of the yoke, to set the oppressed free and break every yoke?" Biblically, during a fast, we are giving up something to focus our thoughts on God. Today, I'm inviting you to consider the ways you may be individually or organizationally contributing to a culture that dismisses or diminishes the value of God's creation for pleasure, entertainment, or profit. If we want to end child trafficking, we have to expose the things that contribute to the exploitation of our youth. When young survivors tell us, "Culture groomed me before I met my trafficker to believe this is what women are created to do," we have to acknowledge places where we are willingly or unintentionally contributing to this injustice. What is it that God may be asking you to give up in order to loose the chains of injustice and set the oppressed free? Our hypersexualized culture, pornography use, media from provocative advertising to popular music and television shows, and the lyrics in our music that glorify a pimp culture and continue to commodify women. What are we scrolling through, binging on, and consuming without truly giving it much thought? As adults, we may be able to compartmentalize those things, but we don't do as good a job of that as we'd like to think. However, in doing so, we are normalizing exploitive behaviors, and that has much bigger implications. Where is it that God may be asking you to fast or to untie the cords of the yoke to set the oppressed free? Are you willing to look around and recognize the injustice that surrounds us? Perhaps in doing so, you will find some of these chains that have been broken are your own. At Araminta, you will often hear us say that this happens because community and family has broken down, and we know that to be fully restored, a survivor needs to be surrounded by healthy community. Our single greatest need currently is for trauma-informed mentors who can walk alongside a survivor on their journey to healing. We need both male and female mentors as we are currently mentoring male children of our survivors, and our plans are to expand our program to provide for male survivors of this issue, as young boys are the fastest growing demographic being targeted by traffickers. To learn more about our mission to see every child free and to train to serve our survivors directly, please go to our website at aramintafreedom.org. Our next volunteer training is on Wednesday, February the 17th. Thank you for this opportunity to share about the work that we do at Araminta, work that will continue until every child is free.
One of the most tangible ways that you can make a difference in our city is by getting involved in mentorship opportunities. There are various nonprofits and organizations throughout our city that do mentorship with young people in their teens and early adulthood. Araminta is one of those opportunities. It's through these organizations and these nonprofits that we can come alongside young people and we can instill love and hope and compassion into their lives, that they have an adult that is present and willing to engage with them and meet them wherever they're at. If you want to get involved in mentorship in our city, we'd love to connect you with some opportunities for you to do that. Feel free to send us a message or send us an email at info@foundrybaltimore.com. Here at the Foundry, we like to talk about where your generosity goes. And one of the places that your generosity goes to is helping with justice initiatives here in our city and in the region and beyond. One of those justice initiatives that we are passionate about here is sex trafficking. We know that there are countless boys and girls that are caught up in the cycle of slavery in the form of sex trafficking, and we want to do something about it. So when you give here at the Foundry, your money goes to help liberating these individuals from their bondage. It goes to adults and organizations coming alongside these people and giving them the support they need as they heal from this traumatic experience. Before we leave today, I want to let you know about one thing that is happening here at the Foundry in the upcoming days. We are just a few days away from the start of Lent, and as you may know, the start of the Lenten season begins with Ash Wednesday, which is 1 week from this Wednesday. On that day, we're going to be hosting 2 different events. First, we're going to be opening up our room in the morning for opportunities for prayer. Similar to what we did in November on Election Day, you have the opportunity to sign up for a time slot and to pray over some prompts here in this room as we begin the Lenten season. Secondly, on Ash Wednesday, we're going to be hosting a special live stream event at 7 p.m., both on YouTube and on Facebook. It's going to be a unique service that you can engage with, and we would love to see you there. We'd love for you to be a part of that. Next week, we're going to be concluding our series, A Better Kingdom, and I hope that you will join us for that. See ya.